Welcome to another episode of the Mood Podcast. And this is a special end of year episode that we thought would bring together some of the most meaningful moments from conversations throughout this year, 2025. So you'll hear from guests such as Bryan Schutmaat, Chris Do, Phil Sharp, Marshall Toe, Lauren Walsh, and others. Each clip reflects a different facet of photography and the creative journey, from doubt in discipline to ethics, longevity, and learning how to stay human in the work. I want to genuinely thank everyone who has watched, listened, shared, or written in and sat with these conversations over this year. The support means so much to me and the team. And I hope this episode serves as a moment to reflect, reset, and carry something useful into what comes next. Of course, wishing you a very Merry Christmas and a happy, grounded, mindful start to the new year. I'll see you in it. And of course, happy shooting. Enjoy. What do you think the biggest lie in photography education is today?
Oh, wow. Gosh, Matt, that's a great question, but I have to forewarn you. I don't have a lot of filters. I'm a last year baby boomer that identifies as Gen X. So be forewarned, okay? I think the big lie in photography education today is that if I had to drill it down to one broad statement, too much of it is education that is masking a sales agenda that is being provided to an audience that is instinctively lazy. So that's a science thing. I'm not trying to insult anybody with the word lazy, but humans, we are instinctively lazy. We want it easier. We want it faster. That is, I think, the big lie. People are looking for the quick answer, and there's too much education that is do this, you're good to go. And the problem with that concept in photography, it's nothing's binary. The only binary answers in photography are physics, right? We can't debate the physics. When we talk about creativity, there's no binary. So there's no simple answer. Every question and every answer's got many variables that could impact the outcome. So I also find that part of that lazy, oftentimes the information that people are seeking and the questions that are asked of educators elicit the wrong answers because they're kind of lazy questions. So I think the big lie is just that we have this glut of free education, which is incredible. The resources we have are amazing. But I don't think that the education and the people wanting to be educated are necessarily using it as effectively as they could.
Is that the I guess the product of our environment these days in society, in a world of abundance where we can literally get anything we want, especially in the Western world, in a developed country, we can have whatever we want, basically, right? We can order food, we can order an Uber, we can just turn on Netflix. We don't actually have to leave our sofa. We can play video games to our heart's content. We're used to that world now. Is that the problem of the society generally that we're living in, or is that an issue with the educators themselves and the fact that it's more homogenized than ever? Or I'm guessing there's probably a crossover a lot there.
Yes. So that's the easy answer. I definitely think it's a societal thing, and I don't mean it in, gee, like I'm an old fart and things were better back when. No, I think that these amazing tools and resources we have also kind of conflict with our desire to just take the shortest path, just have the right answer. People want the right answer. There's not a lot of right answers, right? We get the right answers as photographers, I mean, you're a photographer, you go to these incredible locations and you are photographing these incredible portraits of people. Well, that's not just as easy as pick up a camera and go click, right? Your work, evolves around building relationships on the spot. You've just met someone, right? You may be able to pick up a camera and just snap from time to time, but the majority of your work, you've got to create a relationship and create it quickly. And, oh, by the way, deal with all that photography stuff, lighting and exposure and everything else. So there really are no shortcuts in photography. What we have, though, which is the double-edged sword, we have all this incredible technology that has made photography much more accessible, which is wonderful. But I think sometimes what it also does is it kind of creates a false sense of ability. This incredible technology that we have allows people to pick up a camera for the very first time, even a phone for the very first time, and take a picture that is going to be much higher quality than anything I did at age 11 in 1971, right? With a much simpler camera, working with film where you pressed the button and waited 7 days to find out how poorly you did, right? So I think people tend to get a little bit of a false sense of ability, and the cameras allow you to do really pretty well, especially if you're instinctively creative. But you reach a point where you still need to put a foundation below that. And then, when it comes to the educators, the only thing I'll say about that, because I don't really want to snipe at anybody, but we have a glut of educators. And full disclosure, I should say this up front, I'm married to a cognitive psychologist. I always joke that thank goodness she's not a clinical psychologist, or I'd be in a straitjacket by now for sure. But she has taught me a lot about teaching and just about how people learn. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that being a great photographer doesn't necessarily make one a great educator. Those are two very different skill sets. And while I appreciate that you said some very kind things about my photography and people tend to like my work, I could name you hundreds of photographers who I drool over. I don't find myself in that stratosphere. And I think in the last 10 or 15 years, I've come to learn that I may be a bit of a better educator actually than I am a photographer. And I'm proud of that. I'm happy with that because I still get to do my photography.
I like photography. I love business. Someone once said it to me recently, like, what is the purpose of your business? And realizing that I am an entrepreneur, I'm someone who runs a business first, and photography happens to be the way that I do it. Or I serve people first, but photography is just the medium in which I serve people. And I've always run my business that way because I was taught really from a very young age that, like, life is not all about happiness. It's about, the effect that we have on people around us. And like, when you meet people, how can you serve them? How can you make their lives better? And I do that through photography, and more recently, really through my mastermind and helping people run their photography businesses better so that they can have more financial freedom, more free time, or just buy the new camera that they want.
It's like a balance, would you say, between obviously putting food on the table for your family, but also finding meaning in what you do? I mean, happiness is kind of like this thing we throw around, almost just this label we've made up, right, in humanity. But having something to wake up for in the morning, and find meaning from that, and that goes through just serving others, right? Is that something you've found a bit more of a priority for moving forward?
I think it is. It's life priority, really, because it's very easy. I'm a goal-driven person, and it's very easy for me to just see a goal and see the path towards it, and then just put my head down, tunnel vision, and go. But when I do that, you ignore everything else around you, and then your life starts suffering. And it's that pendulum everybody has, right? Oh, my business is doing well. Well, my personal life must be like total flames and chaos. Or if my personal life is doing really well, then I don't know, I'm getting sued by someone. I've never had that happen, but I could see it. Well, but
I thought you had a court case, didn't you?
Oh, that's because I sued someone else.
Oh, you sued someone else. Okay. No more suits since we last spoke?
No more suits since we last spoke. No, thank God. I think that is because anything that comes, I'm not perfect. I would love to say that I've made every client 100% happy, but that's just unrealistic. But any client that's not happy, I'm going to bend over backwards to make it up to them, because I truly care. Like I care how they feel about our experience together, I care about how I've left, them versus how I found them.
Have you ever had a line though where a client has maybe asked too much or have taken advantage of your kindness? Because you can say that, you can be, the customer's always right, but I'd argue the customer's not always right. There's a point where you have to say no, like just you're asking too much now, or you're taking the piss, or my time is worth way more than what I'm actually giving you at the moment.
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, and I hope I'm very good at drawing lines. You're setting boundaries.
It's difficult.
It is difficult, but I'm usually pretty good at kind of realigning people. So, I will do whatever it is I'm doing to maybe make up for it, or even just to serve them in general. But then if they start crossing, like I'll let it go, but then I'll also realign them with like, hey, we're trying to do this. Like, is what we're doing right now still serving that purpose, right? Have we already made up for whatever small little error that I've made that now you're, going crazy over still? It's always the clients with the crazy eyes, though. I have to say, it's
yeah. And there's many of them around. Yeah. I mean, I've been that person.
Crazy eyes? You don't have crazy eyes.
No, I think. Well, sometimes you'd have to ask my wife, but yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to managing expectations, especially in the service industry. And people forget that about photographers. You're serving someone, whether it's a brand or an individual customer, right, or a wedding client, whoever it might be. You're providing a service to someone else. And so there's always kind of like this subservient nature of, well, I'll do whatever you need me to do. But if those expectations aren't aligned at the beginning, right, you'll get scope creep and people try to push a little bit more. Oh, I didn't know that wasn't part of it. And they try and play that game, right?
Yes.
So I think that's comes to just being a good business person, right? In terms of being strong in those expectations.
Figuring it out, making the rules and figuring out when to bend them.
Yeah. Tell us about the mastermind then. This is a new thing, I think, since we last spoke.
It is. Yes. When we last spoke, it was not even a thought. I just started it in the beginning of the year in January. Well, I guess more towards February, but it's all business, 100% business. And like
give us a bit of context, because you have Photo Insiders, which is kind of your
photography.
Education. Okay.
Yeah. Photo Insiders, which is photography education, monthly content, community. But this is all business. And like I mentioned before, I've always loved business, but I had a really hard time teaching it because it never brings in the numbers. When I post on YouTube and about business, it's like crickets, right?
Really?
But if I post about, I don't know, your autofocus settings and the latest Canon camera, I'm going to get a bazillion views on something like that. So, because,
a lot of hobbyists, I guess.
Hobbyists, but also people are trying to figure out how to use the camera. And I mean, just photography in general. I mean, what photographer picked up a camera like, I can't wait to do marketing.
Yeah.
I can't wait to figure out my accounting and tax strategy, right? You just don't do that. So you're not going to spend your time watching all these business videos when that's not technically what you're passionate about. But that's also why there's such a lack of business education in the photography industry. Well, I can't say that. There's a lot of business education in the photography industry, but it's not as robust.
Well, there is a lack of it. Well, certainly in my perception of the photography industry, there's so much in terms of, your technical types of photographers and YouTube videos, and that's probably why, because they know it does well.
It does well.
But and the reason why I sound surprised at this, I'm sorry to interrupt what you're saying, but in my experience and having so many people reach out to me and ask, how do I make this a business? How do I make this full time? I want to transition. And I guess because a lot of people start out just on the hobby side of it, like, I just want to try photography, and then they love it, and then they get good at it, and then they think, maybe I can actually do something with this. But there's this huge dearth of people of knowledge in how to transition from I can take photos to I can run a business taking photos.
And it's funny because the most questions I get asked are about business, not about the camera.
But maybe it's just YouTube.
It might be just YouTube. Well,
Instagram's the same.
Instagram's the same. And then when I speak at conventions and stuff too.
I found myself really yearning for community connection, like, just talking about work and what it means to us. And I've been trying to cultivate that more and more, as you saw with the workshops.
Yeah, I think the workshops were really interesting to kind of see behind the curtain with you. I guess explaining is the wrong word, but at least kind of elaborating on your wonderful photographs without, and we'll talk about this as well, 'cause it's interesting, but without giving too much to the viewer or to the audience, and to still allow this kind of like poetic interpretation of what we think's going on, or how we make sense of the work. Is this kind of a deliberate ploy, I guess, that you think is really important in photography, or at least the kind of the fine art or post-documentary photography world, in leaving a little bit to the interpretation of the viewer?
I think so. I think photography's all the things that it leaves unsaid can be really powerful. So I absolutely love the space for ambiguity, subjectivity, the imagination that viewers bring to it. I think is really important. And if you have something too buttoned up or that is explained too well, I think that you kind of rob the reader of that, the viewer of that.
That being said, there's a definite intent behind. I mean, we'll talk about. I mean, you've got plenty of books out there, of which I have some here with me now. I'm the proud owner of some black market copies. No, I'm not. It's like I bought.
Nice.
We look at all of your work actually, but especially your latest work, Sons of the Living. There is some intent behind narrative suggestions, should we say, and kind of like the deeper complexities of those layers and the story that you're trying to exhibit in this work. So, I mean, how do you kind of balance that tension between what you want to say to the world, but also leaving that ambiguity that you think is important for the viewer?
Oh, I think that limitation is a little bit inherent in the medium. We talk about narrative and photography, but you can't really be storytellers in the way that a journalist can be a storyteller, or even a filmmaker, or someone writing a novel, or any of the above. Like, we can have in large part narrative suggestion, narrative hints, but we can't be storytellers in any kind of complete sense, unless we just caption everything and put it together like it's some kind of like very extensive magazine article. I think there's going to be all of these gaps that the viewer is going to fill in, and sometimes that can be really fruitful in terms of again, like poetic interpretation, the imagination that people bring to it. There's like a lot of meaning between pictures. I think that it's not just about everything that's in the image, but the atmosphere that's created that almost extends beyond one picture to the next. There's like a world that's created that people can exist in when they're looking at a good photo book, I would say.
And that world that you depict, it often is the American West. What is it about? I mean, obviously you're American and you're from Texas. I think you were born in Houston, Houston or Austin. Yeah.
I live in Austin, and I was born in Houston. And Texas is an interesting state because it's such a big state that it's kind of part of the American South, and it's kind of part of the American West. I would say Texas is where the South becomes the West. So I was always drawn that way because of the grandeur of the landscape. Coming from Houston, I was in search of those kind of places, because Houston, even though you think of, cowboys and country music and the rodeo and all that, it's an urban kind of place, and then a very sprawling suburban environment around it. So growing up, I really, was seeing a lot of parking lots and billboards and strip malls and things like that. And by the time I was old enough to get in a car and drive myself, I was always like hitting the road and trying to find more open places.
And how did photography start? I mean, you went to art school. How did the whole kind of photography thing come about? And what was the point where was there a seminal moment where you went, oh, yeah, I'm in, this is me?
Yeah, I know there wasn't like one of those epiphany kind of moments for me. I was always interested in cinema. So I loved cinematography and how things were depicted in movies. And I took a still photography course in college, and it was a slow growth. It wasn't like a like an epiphany kind of moment or any kind of light bulb that went off. It was an interest that grew. And then it turned into a passion over time that was something I could never let go of.
And Sons of the Living was over time, right? I mean, we can talk about my other favorite book, Grays of the Mountain Sends, but the time span that you spend on these projects, first of all, is it like a deliberate book in mind? It's like, oh, I'm going to go and I want to, create this and it to be a book at the end, or at least a project? Or is it kind of just see how it goes, follow your curiosity, and then tell me about the time span of each of these projects, because I think people will be surprised.
Well, I'll start with Grays, the Mountain Sends, because it came out first. That I shot over the course of a year and a half. I was in graduate school at the time, and I had a deadline. I had to get my thesis done and all that. So I did that pretty quickly, I'd say. And then got it out there. And then I didn't mean for Sons of Living to take as long as it did. I was hoping probably when I started, I would be done within a couple years. But yeah, just I kept going at it. And I didn't shoot all that much. It's not like I was shooting for 10 years straight. It was like a couple weeks per year. And I think that benefited the work a lot, because I think the distance between the time that you take a picture and the time that you consider it for the book is a real benefit. I think stepping away from the emotional memory of taking the picture, meeting the picture on its own terms, without like that connection to it is pretty important. And then just like living life and growing as a human being as you're making this big project as I thought was very beneficial as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, Sons of the Living was over 9-10 years. You must have obviously changed as a person, changed as an artist. Did you see much of that technique or that evolution in the work that we obviously don't notice, but was it evident?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you want to talk about technique and technical stuff, I mean, the prints and how I was kind of processing images and printing at the beginning versus the end changed a lot. There was like a different way I handled tones that I thought got a lot better, just because that's what we do. We live life and we hopefully get better at things. So just like the visual nature and the kind of, aesthetic of everything changed over time. And then also, yeah, just as a person who's moving through the world and the kind of things that we take notice of or the things we care about, I would say I changed from, when did I start that? 2014, I would have been 30 years old. And then, finished in 2023, just as I was about to turn 40. So, it was like all of my 30s. I hope we change as people during that decade. I had a good 30s, but anyway, yeah, I feel like there was a different kind of curiosity I had by the end, or maybe little different things I want to say about the world, perhaps.
The first thing is, a lot of people think they're entrepreneurs or solopreneurs when they're actually just freelancers and they haven't figured out how to run a business. And the telltale sign is, when I ask people how much money you're making, they'll tell me a number. And I say, well, if we had to pay somebody to do your work for you, how much money would be left over, so that you actually don't touch anything. You're not allowed to touch anything. You're allowed just to manage. And when we put it that way, then most of them are negative revenue or negative profit, I should say. They don't understand that what they're really doing is not building a business, but just charging some kind of project day rate in which there are no guarantees for future work. There's no guaranteed income. There's nothing like that. That's a surprisingly common mistake that a lot of quote unquote entrepreneurs are making, or solopreneurs. They haven't even entered into entrepreneurship.
Where do we start? If we're thinking, my biggest concern for many, I bring it back to myself, but I'm a great example of many out there as probably one of those types of people, and very, very concerned about pushing too much because I'm worried that it's going to desensitize, or I'm going to lose that passion for what I want to do. And so there's this kind of no man's land between, getting a little bit of income and being kind of that freelance persona, and then scaling into something that is scalable and sustainable, but without losing, really why we do this in the first place. Where do we even start with this?
All right, let's clarify then. I think what I understand you saying is, if I just hire people to do the work, then what am I doing? Am I just a corporate paper pusher? Is that what I do? I'm a telephone artist where I just telephone people and tell them what to do. Okay, so let's just assume then that you want to do the work yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you were to bid the projects as if someone else were working on it and leave room left over for profit, then you've entered into at least entrepreneurship. So let's just say to hire a comparable photographer to do what you do, to put them on salary, it would cost about 120K. Let's just say that for round numbers, okay? It could be more or less. It doesn't really matter. Just use this number as an illustration. And then there's probably a project manager of some sort. Some of us have reps, they do that for us, but you need some kind of project manager to do the bidding, to do the contracts, to book different people. So that person has to be accounted for. Let's say this person is 65K on an annual basis. We need to look at everything on an annual basis because every time I ask people how much it costs, they start quoting me hourly or day rates. That's how I know they're not thinking of it as an entrepreneurship thing, okay? Now, if you had to pay these people this amount of money, in most places to cover their taxes and insurance and some liability stuff, you probably have to add another 20% on top of that. Okay, so that is just your base labor costs. We're not accounting for overhead, for software, for purchasing of equipment, things like that. When you start adding all that stuff up, it starts to look like a really big number. And then when you have all that number totaled up, that's just your break-even number. You need to add in profit to that. So you're going to add in 20 to 25%. Cool. Now you have understanding how to build a business. Here's the cool part. You can still choose to do the work. And here's the best part, which is you just choose to do the projects that you feel most passionate about. Maybe you don't want to do retouching. Maybe you don't want to scout locations. Maybe you don't want to do test shoots. That's what an assistant photographer or an assistant is able to do for you. Or, it's the 10th dog food commercial or photo shoot, and you don't really want to do it anymore. You've done the 9. You don't need to do the 10th one. The tone, the style, all that's been set up. And you want to get yourself to that point in which you're doing the high level creative stuff. Now, I've been fortunate to work on campaigns. And I remember one time when we flew to China, we were working with one of the biggest fashion photographers in China. And she had 3 sets going on at the same time, all the time. 3 simultaneous projects going on. And you know what she did? She walked in after somebody had done all the lighting setup. She made some notes. They fixed it. And she came in, they handed her the camera. She pushed the button a couple of times. And then she walked on to the next set. And the whole machine has been built around this. So you could say, like, what is the most essential thing that you have to do and that gives you joy that no one else can do? Everything else you can delegate to someone else. So I'm not saying that you have to be removed from the business. You can just choose which parts you enjoy the most.
What if we don't want to work for other people, i.e. have that, the commercial distance or connection between us and, receiving a paycheck, right? Mm-hmm. What if we want to go down, really dive into the self-brand route and figure out what we're worth in that respect, especially in the content world, the social media world, and this attention economy that we live in? How can we dive into that if we don't want to be sequestered by some brand and some commercial entity that's dictating our creative outlet and how much we're going to get paid?
So you want to be free from doing client work, right? This is fantastic. So you're going to move into the realm of content creator / artist. And so what I would recommend most people do is keep the client work going, but don't let that be the only thing that you're working on. Start a side thing. And this is where you need to build up an audience, okay? Now, let's just say that you really enjoy fine art photography. You want to be the next Ansel Adams or whoever it is that makes beautiful art that people just want to buy and hang in galleries. This is cool. And you can do this, right? And so you can build up a body of work and probably go and hit the streets and try and find a gallery, do a group exhibit, and then eventually get to a solo show and hobnob with museum curators and artists and rich people, and so that your name gets known. And then you start working on your story because people will buy the image, but they're really buying the story behind the image maker. And so you have to develop your own mythology. And I think that's a good thing. So this is where you're doing brand building. There's a family friend, pretty distant, who was an aspiring artist. And he worked in his parents' restaurant. And one day, one of the patrons who come to the restaurant, they love the food, noticed a painting on the wall, a painting that he had done. And the patron asked, where'd that painting come from? And he was so embarrassed that it was his that he thought it was like, oh my gosh, it's mine. So he didn't know what to do. But eventually what has happened is that person said, I want to buy that painting. And he has this other career and he's able to build it. But here's the real interesting thing. His hook, his point of differentiation is he would go and source rare earth materials and make his own paints. So maybe the painting is the same. Maybe it looks the same to everybody, but the fact that he makes his own paints, which many painters do not do, gives it a different kind of story. And then they start building this thing up, and now he has enough money to buy an island kind of thing. So that's option one. Option number two is you make content that commands a lot of attention and there's a lot of engagement. You shoot things that is your form of self-expression, and a lot of people tune in to watch it. And now you can do brand deals. Now you still have a client in a way, but it's not the same relationship because there's a lot more leverage on your side. You get to make your art. Somebody's like, we love what you do, Matt. We would love for you to do it with our thing. Would that be possible? And you're like, well, if you're willing to pay this amount and I get to do whatever I want, then yes, we can do this. And they can pay you tens of thousands, sometimes six figures or more, depending on how big you are and what kind of audience you can command. You can do all three simultaneously, by the way. You don't have to choose one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I think the big lesson there, and I talk about this all the time as well with my students, is just figure out, the story is underpinning all of this, right? But diversity of income or diversity of revenue streams and those opportunities is super important as well, especially in that artist self brand world. But let's unpack the content thing a little bit, because it's such a maze, right? And the way you describe all this is so articulate, by the way, and make it sound simple. In reality, it's simple on paper, but just going out and not being a princess and just gonna smash this is obviously hard work. And so I just want to caveat that. The content thing is a whole different ballgame altogether. And you being a master of content, and we're going to kind of get into a little bit of your background in a minute, but what with AI right here, we were talking about this before we kind of went live, and this potential situation where things are going to change very rapidly in the content space. I mean, they have been anyway, but even more so probably over the next 12 months. Where do you see the opportunities lie in the content space as an individual artist and self-brand? But more importantly, how do we even build that audience? You talk about like creating audience. Isn't building an audience just going to be more and more difficult?
I think for the short term, it is going to be more difficult because there's a proliferation of AI generated content. And what's happened is there's a flood of quote unquote image makers and photographers who previously had no experience doing this kind of stuff. So instead of competing against 100,000 photographers, you are probably competing against 10 million plus photographers and image makers. And you're most definitely under threat. You may have seen the client pipeline slow down or people asking for ridiculously low prices, and you're feeling that downward pressure. I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to anybody, and you're probably like really angry and it's like, God, freaking AI, I hate AI. You know what? If we could collectively hold hands and just say a prayer and then make the AI stuff go away, we should do that. But in the world that I live in, that doesn't happen. And so what we have to do is we have to make a decision. Now we can stay with it the way we've been doing it for the last 10, 20 years, or we can try to adopt AI tools into our workflow and try to imagine more. I've noticed a couple of things because I consume a lot of content. I've noticed people who report on the fashion industry about how certain streetwear brands have blown up. They are a photography or image-based brand. And so they create a narrative or they create surrealistic visuals. And I'm sure when I look at these images pre-AI, it was kind of expensive and difficult to do. This is a good thing for them because that means the images will stand out. They'll pop. And that's what kind of disrupts the social feed, right? But if you're a smaller upstart brand, you're like, we can't afford to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this. What if that idea doesn't work? So if you want to stand out and you can't afford to take on this gigantic financial expenditure because you're still relatively new in the marketplace, you can work with somebody with vision and they can imagine incredible things and use their artistic eye to shoot some or all or parts of and expand or mix and match. And the what you can create today in a very from photoreal to hyper stylized can be created with the right person and a curatorial eye.
If we only pay attention to the headlines, there's just the appropriate response is despair. But honestly, when you go into the world and wrap your arms around it, you realize that it's one piece of the story and that actually we are in the middle of the story. And so much of the hope personally I see is in in the rivers and the trees and the nature and the creatures around us. And if you listen really closely, they're all telling us a lot of things. And I think some of them are that just grief and hope live side by side, and that our future is actually not written yet. We get to decide, what the story is. And I think our hope is that we all choose to not just feel, but to act and to move beyond, I think, like, just observation, and become, I would say, like, realizing the power within all of us, like the power of, us each as individuals to make concrete changes in our future, in our world. And and I think that there's just so many beautiful stories I see all the time when I choose to look. Um, and that, I've recently been looking at all the trees, outside. And I think it's so funny when you start paying attention to the nature around us, and you realize, like, how we've made ourselves the center of the story. And, you know, in some ways, like, humans have turned this narrative around where we're like, oh, they're just the backdrop to our story. When actually, if you're paying attention, you realize, like, we are the backdrop to their story. They've been around, thousands of years longer than us. Same thing with species. And I love going to nature, honestly, for this sense of hope. Like, I mean, look at any creature, look at monarch butterflies. Like, I love thinking about, like, the journey. They make this journey around the world, and not one single life will ever be able to see the whole journey. But yet, somehow, they know, the next generation where to go to pick up that journey and to keep going where they need to go. And there's just something so magical and wondrous about life and this, just everything around us. And it's not that I don't feel despair and that I'm, just ignoring all of the things that we are doing, the impacts that we are having. I mean, I know very well. Um, but I also know that when we give it a chance, like, just even a tiny chance, um, how resilient, and I know that that word is really overused, but I have seen how nature and humans can heal and regenerate. And, so much of that is just about paying attention and figuring out, like, how do we heal ourselves in this world around us. And I know that's very long-winded, but yeah, I actually have quite a lot of hope and optimism for this world.
Well, that's was wonderful to hear, and there's so many things that we can take away from just what you said. And I don't want to dwell too much on your background because we have limited time, and people can go and you're very much present in the midst. We can, I've obviously followed you for a long time, and this is a common theme of your narrative and what you talk about and what you try and educate. And what's so inspiring is you live through what you talk about. But when we see statistics and data like 73% of wildlife disappeared in the last 50 years, in the last 50 years blows my mind in both an extremely sad way, but a very shocking way. And it's sometimes I feel like hope can become despair or change into despair quite rapidly. And hope is this artificial thing that we cling on to just to try and make ourselves feel better. How can we move from hope to activism or change, or whether it's us or the other side of the world who aren't kind of at the forefront of this? What can we do with our cameras, with our voices, in order to try and make a difference? And I'm going to bookend that question with I guess, a deeper one that I'm not sure we know the answer to, but why do you think so many people don't care about these existential threats, not just to ourselves, but to the planet, to the wildlife, to nature, to everything that you and I and many other people care about? What is it ingrained? I watch a lot of this stuff. I read a lot of this stuff. We care a lot about the same things that you do. And the biggest question that always sits over the top of me is, well, why does no one else care? Why are we this self-centered species that just care about making the next buck and getting attention from the wrong areas rather than giving attention and paying attention to the more meaningful ones? That is many questions in one statement. Pick anything and run with it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that humanity is incredibly, we're so intelligent, and we have like this ability. We're probably the only species that has the ability to like look in the past and also think about the future, right? And that's really, really special. I think, though, in our great, discoveries to make this world more comfortable for ourselves, what we've done is actually created this world where we're so disconnected in a lot of ways, and scared, I think, of discomfort, and and actually, I think many of us who have the privilege of really embracing the discomfort, and that I mean in many ways, like metaphorically and literally, like whether it is, intellectual discomfort or physical discomfort, for some spiritual discomfort, like whatever it is. I think a lot of it is wrapped around like this desire to put ourselves in a cocoon and not have to feel the discomfort. And actually, when we can't escape it, truthfully, it is part of being human. And I think when we walk towards all the things that make us afraid, it reconnects you. When you choose to really feel the despair of what is happening. I started off and mentioned it earlier, but like love and grief are neighbors, they are intricately connected. And I think by trying to prevent ourselves from grieving, it also means that we're not loving in the same way. And that we need to all open up ourselves, and our hearts, and allow ourselves to love one another, this world, the creatures we don't understand that might make us, feel afraid. And I think we're so afraid of like fear and disconnection. All those things are so intricately connected. And I just think on a pragmatic level, like it's so easy to get reconnected. It just involves like really pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think like we all have to work to that. And once you're there, you realize like how absolutely magnificent and how little there is to be afraid of. In the, I'm talking in big sweeping terms here. Like there's a lot to be afraid of, actually. But at the same time, I just think about, for me, it's like, the natural world. And I also mean that you don't have to travel far. Like even in the most urban landscapes on the planet, there is so much nature all around us. You don't have to travel to the most remote places on the planet. And in fact, I don't think it's good to do that because, we need to keep some of these places pristine, and we don't need more human impact. Like one of my things lately is like, we don't all need to be going to Antarctica and to like all corners of the planet. And, we're impacting nature. So how do we live more? It's a question for all of us. How do we live with less, a little more in our communities? And I think when you are like really fully involved in your community, You see how much you can do. And all the stories that I tell in my work are really very much based on communities coming together to like reimagine this world which we've woven. And it's really important to remember that we have woven this, like we've done this, and that, human ingenuity is beautiful. But I do think, you know, you've asked these big questions. I don't know the answer to all of them, but I think that over and over again, I see that it's really important not to just give up. like, like, just empathy and love and care and being engaged and wrapping your arms around anything you can that makes you more engaged is like the way forward.
Give me some idea of how you've evolved as a person through doing this craft. I imagine, the things that come to mind just through my own experience, but as well as kind of seeing a little bit of behind the scenes of how you work. Patience, empathy. I mean, it was really interesting. I think I heard, maybe it was the chat you had with Sean Tucker, who was also on the show earlier this year. You said many of us feel nervous, right? Walking in, even if they're maybe actors who I know you photograph a lot, but nervous walking to a room either full of strangers or just with one stranger that you haven't and then suddenly now this camera and this kind of weird contrived environment. Is that the real skill to kind of understand that energy and to empathize with it, and then to provide this almost this safe space where people can really eventually be themselves. Is this, that maybe, is that, I'm probably putting words in your mouth. Is that something that you've really learned to hone over the years? And if so, is there anything else that's really?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's all stuff it's continual learning process, and I never stop learning. So the way I communicate with my sort of sitter is constantly evolving, and it changes from person to person. It isn't sort of one sort of set way of doing things. It's because I think empathy is really one of the key ingredients to being to what I do, at least. Yeah, you have to understand how your sitter is feeling to some degree, in order to get the best out of them, or to get them to where you want them to sort of be with you in that environment, I suppose. And so, I mean, and everyone different. It can be professional actors. Professional actors can still be very shy and nervous. And, actors are just like any other job. Actually, there's a full spectrum of type of person that does that particular job. So, but I guess what I do expect from actors, I suppose what I try to do is communicate to whoever I'm working with in a language that I understand, or language that I think they'll understand rather. And what an actor should understand is that their thoughts and feelings and body language are all communicating something. And so, that's what I'm going to be photographing. And so, when they sort of, first sit down, I'll be taking pictures of somebody who will be thinking, I wonder what I should be doing. That's what the pictures will say, because that's what the person is thinking. But then as time moves on, hopefully my sitter will start thinking or feeling other things. And then that's what I start to photograph. So yeah, it's not really. I was chatting to somebody at a party once, and I was explaining kind of what I do, and she works as she had something to do with like neuro-linguistic programming, basically. And she was like, you're what you're doing is neuro-linguistic programming. And I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't really thought about it like that. But, you know, the words you use when you meet somebody, and I don't really think about this in my personal life at all, but like in my professional life, I suppose I do. But it's like, you know, I won't say to somebody like, I won't even say like, oh, don't be nervous, because I don't want to say the word nervous. I'd say like, you know, this process is easy. You know, this is a space where you can like just do your job. It's like using like positive words rather than like, you know, don't be stressed, because I often, you know, I think you're sort of putting that word into someone's head.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think you can use language, and it's not about like tricking people. It's not, you know, you're not, but it's just about trying to create an environment, because your sitter in my work, obviously, like you're both trying to do the same thing, right? You're both trying to make a good picture together. Like your sitter wants to help you to help them, you know. So you're just trying to like find your way together to make that happen for each other. I think, you know, the only times I sort of struggle, I think, is if somebody has a lack of experience and or they've got too many like preconceived ideas of like what they should be doing. But you know, again, if it's an actor, and you know, they could be the sort of actor who is sort of like, you know, sort of a generally sort of nervous and sort of stressy kind of person, but they will understand that what you're doing is making something together. So, you know, what you're fundamentally doing is turning this 3D real life space that you're in, and you're converting it into 2 dimensions. And what is that going to communicate? That image that you make together, like what is that? So, you know, anyone with any type of experience as an actor will kind of understand that that's what you're trying to do together. And so, yeah, it's this sort of space between performance, but then like all, you know, really good performance, it's actually truthful. So that's the sort of little frequency that me and my sitters try to sort of meet on, I suppose.
Tori, what do you mean when you say, you know, I understand this dichotomy or this kind of evolution from performance, because everyone performs in their own way when they come in, right? Especially if it's new to them, whether they're an actor, great you know, that's kind of often their natural state, or if it's a non-actor, they still have the shield on and a mask until you're able to really get underneath and just allow them to show their true selves. What do you mean, like good performance is really truth? Is that what do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose it's a performance in the sense that they are sat in front of you and you're pointing a camera at them. So, but I think, because what I've sort of ended up doing is it's just basically telling my sitters just to like listen to music. You know, I'll just play music loud and just listen. And so it's a performance in the sense that, yeah, like, you know, that you've constructed this this environment. But then I think, yeah, it really, I suppose it's the sense of sort of sincerity or sort of truthfulness, I suppose, just comes from when I think I sense that my sitter has sort of stopped trying to do anything other than listen to music, and then just have the capacity to be able to sort of share that with the camera to some degree.
As in whatever's coming up for them in that moment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, you know, music can trigger thoughts of, you know, family and lovers and, you know, memories of all sorts. And so I suppose it's those kind of emotions or sort of like, I don't care what they're thinking about or whatever, you know what I mean? That's irrelevant to me, but I can sense. I mean, just chap I was photographing yesterday, he's a lovely guy, quite kind of inexperienced, and you know, it probably took about 2 hours until I really sensed that it sort of clicked for him that like, oh, like it's the personal feelings that I should be, that's okay for me to be thinking about. And then there's this sort of like realization in your sitters that that's the interesting stuff. It's not, you know, don't try and look interesting. Don't try and do anything. You know, it's yeah, it's a weird paradox. There's a lot of paradoxes in photography, I think. There's a lot of paradoxes in sort of talking about this. You know, like I tell my sitters, like, you don't need to think about how the pictures look at all. Because if that's what you're thinking about, that's what the pictures will look. There'll be pictures of somebody thinking about how do I look. Maybe that's what you want. I mean, that's what sort of fashion photography is in a way, right? It's like, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's, you know, somebody like just looking cool, and that's great. But it's not necessarily what I'm doing, I suppose.
I mean, one of the things I didn't say, but which I feel very strongly about with photojournalism is that it provides you literally a visual record of history. And without the visual record, yeah, I mean, history can be manipulated full stop, even with visual records, but it's harder to rewrite history when you do have these records. And even if you're in a state controlled space and the records aren't coming out in the present moment, the creation of the evidence, I think, is very important.
Yeah, that's a good point, which I didn't really think about. But when it comes to those records and people going through so much to create these records and to create narratives, I guess, how have you seen it impact people's mental health? Well, you know, why is that not suddenly, but why is that such an important part that you want to teach and mentor and approach?
I mean, I think it started for me. You know, I've been working with photographers globally who cover conflict for a long time. And then I started working on a book it's called Conversations on Conflict Photography. And it's a series of interviews with photographers from around the world and with some photo editors. And essentially the premise of the book was kind of like, what's the point? What is the point of conflict photography? And I really wanted to answer that question, not because I think there's no point, but because I wanted to just kind of open the question up and think through what is the work that it does? Is it successful? When does it fail? What are the challenges? And in conducting the interviews for that book, one of the things that really jumped out at me as the author was almost every person I spoke to, without them necessarily always being aware of it, would tell me things that essentially suggested, like, you have really dealt with some emotional tolls here. And some people were more aware and would say, like, oh, I experienced X and had PTSD, right? Like, kind of cause and effect thing. And then other people were much less aware and would tell me stories like one person was saying how for the longest time, anytime somebody would just light a match, right, he'd get really freaked out because the smell reminded him of TNT from some bombings he'd covered. And another person was talking about how she had photographed a very deadly, bloody attack and took one photograph of a young man, maybe like 17 or 18, and he's dead, and it's it's one of those photographs that editors would say like, oh, this is a good composition. It's a strange thing to say when you're talking about a young man who's been killed, but it's a powerful photo. And the photographer is also quite young. So this young man was probably not that much younger than her, a bit, but not more than maybe 10 years. And she was telling me about how she didn't understand it, but every single day for weeks, she would open her laptop and look at the picture of this boy and start crying. And that to me was a very clear signal of like, you're processing something, but not processing it effectively. And you're still kind of stuck in this trauma, but she didn't see it like that. Right. So I was just kind of doing these interviews and hearing all of this. And the book is not specifically about mental health, although that winds up becoming a thread through the book. But the more and that book took me 4 years to do. And in that process, I started realizing like mental health tolls for photojournalists in hostile environments are real. And I was doing research on the side about that and learning more about like is there any published literature on this? And there was a bit most of it was focused specifically on PTSD, which is a very clinical condition. And there wasn't the kind of looser categories of anxiety or burnout or depression. And so I just kind of started more and more work on that. I did another book a few years later that was essentially about kind of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movements. But at this point, I was already aware that journalists working in hostile environments are facing these kinds of risks. And so I knew that was going to show up in my research and interviews. And lo and behold, it did, right? The kind of mental health tolls of covering a pandemic, which is kind of inescapable. It's this invisible enemy that seems to be lurking everywhere. And then, the Black Lives Matter movement were some of the most physically dangerous for American journalists in a way that the United States had not seen physical attacks on journalists before. So, it was just kind of, it's there and it's creeping up. And so I've just been researching and writing publications on it, but then also started advocating for more mental health training as part of safety initiatives. And I'm not the only one. I have a coterie of colleagues who are doing this as well. And so at this point, I'm now co-leading this nationwide initiative for Ukraine, off to Ukraine in a few days to go work on that one. But it's on mental health for Ukrainian media workers. And so like the mental health tolls there are some of the expected tolls, but some is very specific to their situation. And if I were to do a similar initiative for Palestinian photographers or Sudanese photographers, some of it, there'd be some overlap, and then there'd be differences based on the specifics of what's happening locally for these journalists.
How can they, if they don't have Dr. Lauren Walsh to go over and help them and talk to them about how can they help themselves? How can they become aware of this and start processing a better care for their mental health?
So it's an excellent question. And one of the best things to do, which is also impossible for many local photographers and 100% impossible for Palestinian photographers who can't leave. One of the best things is actually to take a break, right? But you can't say that to someone for whom there's no break, right? Like the war is engulfing you, not you've chosen to go and cover the war. So barring the ability to say like, step back for a bit, take a break, you have to try to find other strategies. Like, so there are online resources for photojournalists and for journalists at large. Some make use of that, others don't. It also can be culturally specific. If it's a culture that is more open to mental health discussions versus less open to mental health discussions, it can wind up being a really practical resource thing. Like if your Wi-Fi is limited, are you going to read a bunch of articles about mental health, or are you going to make like it? There's also kind of thinking through priorities in that sense. So there are a few situations around the world where I think that it's really, really difficult. The basic tips, even if you like can't get away, is find some kind of self-care practice that can help ground you a little bit, right? So even if it's like, for some people, it's a little bit of exercise. For other people, it's an activity like cooking or knitting. For other people, it's just meditation or yoga. And I know that these, like in the middle of a war zone, it can sound silly to say this, but it doesn't change the war. But if it helps keep you a little more, a little calmer, a little less with these stresses, the reality is it's impossible to remove all these stresses. And even for the photojournalists where you can say like, you need to now take a break, you still are not going to remove all the stresses. Like the stresses are there, and that's part of this kind of work. You just have to find the productive ways of dealing with it. And yeah, so it's not a simple answer. I think also being in contact with people who understand your situation can be very helpful. So I tend to find sometimes that photojournalists, come back from covering something awful and they're like, I don't know how to interact with, like, I can't talk to people right now because they're worried about the subway being delayed and I'm freaking out and having nightmares because of what I saw 2 days ago. So I think just kind of surrounding yourself with people who don't necessarily need to talk it through if you're not that kind of person, but who are not going to ask you questions that feel really off to you.
Yeah, a community that can understand without saying anything, right? Because they've been there, they've done it before, or they've been in similar situations. I think we undervalue sometimes the power of community, even if it's a silent community. And I think as photographers, we can be so isolated in our own head because it's an individual pursuit, essentially. I'm interested to hear about what the community is like in terms of photojournalism and the agencies that all kind of cross-pollinate. But it's a natural course of action that we become these individual, idealists and warriors, and especially when then you're put into that type of environment. It's like you talked about earlier, it's a form of PTSD. You come back from those types of environments if you're able to get out of it intact, and you're like, well, what do I do with myself now? No one understands what I went through. No one gets it. So I think that's why community and can be so important, and can be lacking sometimes, if I'm honest. What I see.
Yeah, I will say that therapy can be phenomenal for some people, and I feel like the U.S. maybe has a tendency towards like, oh, if you have an issue, go to therapy. Like,
yeah, therapize everything.
But the studies, the clinical studies that are thinking about kind of journalism and mental health are repeatedly showing exactly what you said, that the best or most successful and in some ways simplest form of the word that's always used as resilience, kind of getting through something, is by having a support network or community. And it actually doesn't need to be colleague, like it can be a social community, but having isolation is not good. Like that is kind of repeated through all the literature. Trying to do it on your own is going to be significantly more difficult than just surrounding yourself with people who make you feel okay.
Define depth for us. So why would this kind of like urge to find this kind of almost abstract thing that we call depth in photography?
I think it's like dissecting your own humanity and everything that you've been through, pain, heartbreak, and everything, and trying to find a way to use that all to create something, to like, and photographing was kind of, that was also soothing for me, especially like photographing wildlife. It was definitely moments where you're able to really be in the moment completely and be, like I remember I stumbled upon a wolf just in this valley, and it got way too close. I got way too close to it, and my heart just started pounding like crazy. And I was scared, but I was I was so thrilled. And that's not the picture that's in the book, but it's definitely one of those moments where, it soothed me, it excited me, it, gave me everything that I think I ever needed and wanted.
Wow. Very, very powerful. What was this? What were you trying to soothe, do you think? Was it this kind of upbringing and loss of identity and not really kind of knowing your place in your immediate world as well as kind of the wider world in general?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of us artists feel the world and see the world a different way. And a lot of that is, there's a lot of pain with that. There's a lot of, of that sense of loss and sense of just trying to find who you are, which is so it's yeah, I don't really know. It's so reactive. It's I think like Jesse, the founder of Charcoal, he always talks about it as an addiction. And I don't go as far as calling it an addiction, but it's definitely something that is it's impulsive, incredibly impulsive. Um and it's beautifully impulsive.
Yeah, so it's I empathize with that a lot. It's this something from deep within that we call it impulsive or innate, that comes out through camera. We kind of try and make sense of it afterwards, right, in a retrospective way, which is why photo books are so wonderful in sequencing and editing and kind of that almost posthumous look at what we've lost or what we've trying to find in terms of the images that we're making. So that kind of brings me on to the book, right? We really want to kind of go deep into what you've just put out there in the world, which is a wonderful piece of work. I mean, I don't have the physical copy, but the physical copy looks, from what I can tell, looks pretty epic in terms of the design and the structure. We'll talk about that. I've been privileged to have an online copy and obviously seen a lot of that. Tell us about it. Let's just start kind of with the title, Blank Notes, and tell us about kind of the subject matter, how it came about, the process, and just kind of your philosophies around what you're putting out there with this book.
Um, yeah, yeah. It was. I think Jesse and I had met about 7 years ago um, at Chico Review, and my work was it lacked depth at that point. It was mainly food, a few portraits, and things like that. And it was encouraged for me to find more depth. uh, it was hard. It was hard going there the first time. I'd never had any sort of criticism, so that was the beginning of that journey of just changing my medium. I was using digital at that time, and not to say that digital's good or bad, but in order to find a different feel, I definitely went towards film. And so that started the journey of just like creating a different narrative that was beyond, the reality that you see it in your immediate environment. Like Daido Moriyama, Daisuke Yokoda, like people like especially Japanese photographers, Masahisa Fukase, were these inspirations early on in that work that kind of gave me the idea that I could make work that was not so literal, and that I could make I can make work, long format work, and make it into kind of a movie. And you look through it like scenes in a slow black and white movie, and with so many mentors in my life like Jesse Lenz and Igor Posner, who kind of really opened my mind to movies and different books, because I was very naive at that moment. I was just doing it impulsively. I wasn't really thinking about anything. But with a lot of mentorship, they kind of just opened me up, and I was able to find that what makes anyone's work unique, and especially mine, is everything that I bring to it, my story, things that have happened in my life, whether they're good or bad, and bringing it to the surface and creating from that feeling as opposed to creating it literally was very beneficial for me. Like the emotions kind of just bled into that creativity, and then allowed for it to continuously flow. Um and then I got too into Japanese horror films, and then all that inspiration just kept going and going, and things were happening in my life that were good and bad. There was a lot of, struggle at that moment of family health and things like that. And yeah, I definitely use a lot of that to um, like help me deal with it. You bring it to the surface and you take some photos, and there's like my dad's writings just in the beginning of the book. He would write these um, Buddhist prayers continuously over and over again. And we decided to put it at the front and the back of the book. And when you open it up, you can feel it. It's very it's a physical thing as well as it's a visual thing.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, I can't wait to actually touch it. But tell us a little bit about. I imagine kind of those life struggles that you had with family health. You can share with us that if you want to. If not, I totally understand. But it seems like that was a real kind of spark for the, I guess, the theme of this book, or certainly the thematic focus and the relationship with life and death and afterlife, before life. Is that true in essence?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, especially with all these rituals, it weirdly influenced me, and also, it, yeah, I had, it's something that I'm not, I'm not even sure if it's necessarily real or not, but um, it, the life and death part and the in between has always felt pretty close, to me, and whether I wanted to or not, when I was growing up, I would have got outdoors slammed shut, open in my room, and there'd be nothing there. So it's always kind of been around, lurking. Um, and like during this um kind of episode of like family health, I'd been feeling very desperate. And when you're desperate, you kind of pray to the heavens and things like that. And things that I'd kind of forgot about as a child, or chose not to really bring with me to adulthood, kind of came back. Not in the way that it did when I was a child, but as an adult, I would get visits in my dreams from people that have passed on, or things like that. So it, I don't know if art was imitating life or life was imitating art, but it was definitely something that's always been very like. Did you ever feel like you walk around at night and there's someone behind you, but there's no one there at all?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I felt like that my whole life.
That's a really good analogy, actually, to kind of describe the book, and that's kind of how it made me feel looking through this. And there's, for people, just some context for people listening and watching you who obviously may not have the book yet, but Jesse Lenz, as in kind of Charcoal Press. You mentioned Jesse. He's founder of Charcoal Press, which published the book. And the book is centered around Taoism, right? So am I correct in thinking it's your father that has this, or has this belief that we live in a supernatural world that existed with the physical world?
Yeah, it's definitely both my parents, and apparently the story is that they started believing in a lot of this stuff because of me. I was very sick as a child.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and I was very, very sensitive. Um, I don't know if I don't know if, like, I don't want it to become like a ghost podcast. and tell more stories. But
Yeah, come on, give us a go. It's Halloween. We're 5 days away from Halloween.
True,
so
that's true. But yeah, I was an extremely sensitive kid, and we would have these rituals and these festivals, the Hungry Ghost Festival, and anytime it's an anniversary of an ancestor, we would go to their grave sites and offer food and leave food, burn paper offerings, which pretty much blank notes. That's kind of where it comes from. Is like the burning of joss paper, to the afterlife for the deceased to spend money in the afterlife. So whenever I was a child, after that, I'd be coming home and I would start getting a fever. And it's happened probably 3 or 4 times in my life, where immediately after being in the cemetery, I would get a really, really high fever, and I would feel like I would be being twisted inside out. And I remember my parents one time when I was at my oldest, which probably was about 12 at the time. I remember just burning. I was seeing red, and they put me in front of the altar, in the middle of the night. I was screaming my head off, and I could just hear them pray and pray and pray. And then I heard a crack in the ceiling, and then it just went silent. And then the fever broke, and I kind of washed my hands of everything. I was like, I don't want any part of this. This is way too scary. So my parents they only told me this recently, that they only started believing in all this stuff because of me, because I scared them to death.
I don't know if that's funny or not. Bless them.
I know, right? It's funny because, I'm 39 now, and they just told me this.